Hi, everyone. My name is Arielle Korman, and I am the co-founder and executive director of Amud, the Jews of Color Torah Academy. We are a for us, by us learning space for Jews of color, by Jews of color. And today I'm also coming to you as myself, as Arielle, as an educator, a learner, and also someone who's been grappling in my own way with trying to bring myself fully to Torah study. And today I'm going to talk a little bit and teach a little bit about one experience that I've had trying to do that, and what it might say about the way in which I think we can all engage in Torah study toward the future. So just a little bit about me. I grew up on the Upper West Side in New York City. And from that place, I did a kind of left field thing, and I went to Davidson College in North Carolina for my college experience. And going to Davidson College was the first time in my life I had been the only Jewish person that many people around me had ever met, the first, the only. And I remember being in a humanities class, and we were reading an excerpt from the quote unquote Old Testament, right, from Genesis. And someone had a question about a detail of the chapter, and suddenly I felt the entire room staring at me. And I realized in that moment, they're viewing me as the Jew in the room. And this is an opportunity, this is an inflection point. I can make one of two choices in this moment. I can either say, honestly, just because I'm Jewish doesn't mean I know the answer to your question, or I can try to delve deeper. And so from that moment on, I really took a deep dive in every way that I could into Jewish learning. Through a domino effect of opportunities afforded to me by the fact that I went to an institution that had means to support my education in every way it could, I wound up at Fulbright, Israel. I was doing a research project after my graduation. And the very first moment I landed, I got to Haifa, to my new apartment, and lo and behold, I had been locked out. I did not have my keys. I didn't know when I was going to find the landlord. I had all my stuff. I was exhausted. And in that moment, what I did was I went upstairs and I knocked on the door of a neighbor and just introduced myself. Was hoping for hospitality and was met with really beautiful hospitality in a lot of ways. This family gave me tea and gave me snacks. I was getting to practice my Hebrew, which was feeling exhilarating for me since I'd been working so hard on it. And then after a little while, the conversation turned a little bit. And the questions that I was getting in Hebrew started to be a little bit more unsettling. I had mentioned that I was Filipina. And for those of you who are not familiar, in modern spoken Hebrew, one of the words that people sometimes use, and sometimes is generous, often use for domestic worker is Filipinit, which means Filipina in the feminine. And that has to do with a trend in which there are overseas workers who come from the Philippines who take care of Israeli elders often, and other people in need of care. And this family started asking me questions about that in sort of the most blunt terms, questions like, how come they don't just stay home and take care of their own old people? And then the questions and the comments got more pointed toward me, and they said, you're coming here and it's problematic. Why is your people here? Knowing that I was also Jewish. And so I felt these parts of my soul being asked to fall apart. These people who were simultaneously offering me incredible hospitality, it felt like they were ripping apart pieces of my being. So The theme for today's day of learning is the bonds between us. The bonds between us. And I want to focus for this conversation um, on what happens when we allow the bonds within us to be torn apart. How does that affect our ability to even show up in relation to the other, in relation to another person? So in this moment, I'm in that room with the neighbors. I'm experiencing this heartbreak, my very first day of my program. And also, I'm in this place where I'm trying to understand my relationship to Judaism, my relationship to land, my relationship to the Hebrew language. And I was feeling very challenged. I was feeling very unable to pray Jewishly a lot of the time while I was there, in part because I felt like I was hyper aware of so many other dynamics around me, including the existence and treatment of Filipino guest workers in Israel. So what did I do? One thing I did was start to scour the internet, because that was the best resource I had at the time, for information about Filipino spirituality. And so for those of you who may not know, the Philippines is a largely Catholic country, that has to do with Spain's 400 years of colonization of the Philippines. There's also a very large Muslim population, but the religion that people practiced before, and many still practice in different forms, is a much more localized one, actually very specific to wherever you are, the island you're on, the specific town. But animism is a really, really common and popular way of understanding the world. The sense of the godliness and spirit nature of everything. It is not monotheistic, although there are ways of sort of explaining the theology where there is some kind of greater union. And yet, to be clear, I'm not trying to make an argument that Filipino religion, pre-colonial religion, is monotheistic. I think it's important to notice distinction where it exists. So I was trying to sort of delve into these stories before Spain colonized, and just find a connection to this joyful part of being Filipino inside of me, as opposed to having to be a sort of translator in some ways for people to understand global capitalism, the factors that bring people from one place to another. I felt so clearly at the crossroads of diaspora, and it was just so important for me to start exploring these stories so that I wouldn't really disappear. I wouldn't disappear into time and space. So I'm now going to show you a little bit of what I did next. So I started looking at these stories, and it kind of got the ball rolling again in a Jewish way. What do I mean by this? Let me show you. So I'm just going to share my screen. No matter how millennial I am, which I am, it is just so hard to navigate technology for me. I have an old soul. But here we are. So I'm going to read you a creation story. It is a Tagalog creation story, and we're going to go from there. When the world first began, there was no land, but only the sea and the sky. And between them was a kite, a bird, something like a hawk. One day, the bird, which had nowhere to light, grew tired of flying about. So she stirred up the sea until it threw its waters against the sky. The sky, in order to restrain the sea, showered upon it many islands until it could no longer rise, but ran back and forth. Then the sky ordered the kite to light on one of the islands and build her nest, and to leave the sea and the sky in peace. Now at this time, the land breeze and the sea breeze were married, and they had a child, which was a bamboo. One day when this bamboo was floating about on the water, it struck the feet of the kite, which was on the beach. The bird, angry that anything should strike it, pecked at the bamboo, and out of one section came a man, and from another, a woman. So just take a second to look at the story, to sit with that story. So here's where I went next. I recalled a quote from Genesis, from Bereshit. And this is the moment in which God creates Ha'adam, the first human being. Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et ha'adam, afar min ha'adama. Vayipach be'apav nishmat chayim, vayehi ha'adam lenefesh chaya. The Lord God formed the man, the human being, from the dust of the earth. God blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living being. So there was a parallel I noticed in these two stories. In this first story, where do the first two humans come from? Within a bamboo reed. And for those of you familiar with bamboo, the inside of a bamboo reed is hollow. So there's a void that exists. And so presumably the first two humans come out of this void. Even though the word Adama, earth, often connotes that brown stuff, the soil, the clay, the human is actually birthed out of the dust of the earth, afar. It is birthed out of God's breath. And so the substance from which we come is actually much more airy, more porous. It's not that we are a solid kind of golem-like figure that comes to life, but rather we are breath. So I noticed a parallel here. Now, this brought me to another quote that's been very, very important in my life. And it's attributed to Rav Simcha Bunim. It's a Hasidic teaching that everyone ought to have two pockets, each holding a slip of paper, so that one must reach for one or another slip as the occasion demands. On one, it should be written, I am but dust and ashes. Anochi afar va'efer. And on one, it should be written, the world was created for me. Bishvili nivra ha'olam. So what does it mean? I am but dust and ashes. Why both? We know that we are dust. We are the dust of the earth, but why ash also? Ash too is an organic kind of matter that is full of porousness and particle bits. It is not just one solid way of being. I'm going to go through a couple other texts and then we'll bring it together, right? So I found another quote from Genesis, and in this moment, God gives us the land. God gives us the land, and God makes us the dust of the earth. So our offspring become the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, then your offspring too can be counted. So what is this substance from which life emerges, right? This void. There's airiness, there's particle matter, and that doesn't just create the first human beings, it also creates a people, right? The thing that creates the animating force for a people is actually the notion of spreading. It's the notion of sort of leaving borders behind, borders of the body, borders of actual land, and spreading. That's what it is to be alive. At least that's what I'm understanding in these texts. What it is to be alive is to spread oneself, to recognize that we are exploding with breath. So what does that bring me to next? We are in the Shemitah year right now. And so we are thinking about rest. We're thinking about our relationship to land. And in Leviticus, God says, the land must not be sold beyond reclaim, for the land is mine. You are but strangers resident with me. So following this idea of liveliness, of aliveness having to do with the porous, with the airy, with the spreading, it would make sense then that we are visitors on the land like dust is a visitor on the land. If you've ever seen parts of Israel, Palestine that are covered in sand, if you've ever seen the way that the wind goes through that sand, the land is not static. The land moves. Even the land itself is not committed to its borders. And if you've ever actually seen a borderland, you'll know that even blades of grass will go from one side of the border to another. You'll know that animals will cross from one side of the border to another. So I have these questions here we can think about. Do you notice any tensions in the above text surrounding the nature of land and place? When you think about being rooted in place or your relationship to land, do you think of that land as solid, porous, or both? I'm going to offer, because this is being recorded, if you would like to pause and think about those sources now, that would be a great opportunity to do so. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. So I want to take you back again to where I was. I was in Haifa. I was looking at these texts, understanding my relationship to the Jewish relationship to land and the nature of aliveness and what it means to be alive as a people. And I got there from looking at this Filipino creation story. Later on in that year, as I was getting ready to leave, I wrote a blog post, and I'm going to read you a short excerpt from that blog post. I do not think land is unimportant, and I feel deep love and heartbreak with those longing for it. Land is what we build our homes on, where plants lay roots. Still, I see a connection between an obsession with land and territory and the idea that humans come from the earth, the solid earth. Conceiving of myself as mated to wind and porousness reminds me to be a more open, flexible person. Indeed, as the Talmud states, a person should always be soft like a reed, and they should not be stiff like a cedar, as one who is proud like a cedar is likely to sin. Some of my most blissful moments this past year have occurred on the bus. A window cracked slightly open, wind coming through as the bus hurtles forward. In times of confusion, being in this place, I have looked not to the landscape outside my window for answers, but to the wind. I like to think of myself as a reed, perhaps broken in a few spots. Then, when I take a deep breath in, I let the sky play me. So I want to pause now and talk a little bit about what I did as this person trying to grapple with my own Filipino-ness, my own Jewishness, my own relationship to land. I went through this experience of sort of gathering these texts before co-founding Amud. So after I did Fulbright Israel, I came back to New York City and I co-founded Amud, the Jews of Color Torah Academy. And Amud is a space in which Jewish people of color, often Jewish people with live stories that don't necessarily come from the Jewish world, although they might. We have many JOCs in our community who feel deeply, deeply, deeply connected to their Jewish ancestors, right? But we also have many, many people with other ancestries. Now, I know it can be very uncomfortable, taboo, awkward in some ways to bring in texts that are not strictly Jewish in Jewish study. I understand that there's a lot of anxiety that comes from it. And I also understand that there are legitimate questions around idolatry. The issue or the question of idolatry is absolutely present throughout so many of our texts. And I recognize that I, as a Filipino person, come from a tradition where there are many practices that my Jewish community might see as idolatrous. And this is something that I'm very interested in, I'm constantly grappling with. But it's very important to me that at a mood, people feel comfortable being able to bring in stories and wisdom from wherever feels authentic to them. Understanding that that does not make us any less Jewish. And in fact, it was looking at that story, that creation story, that sort of ignited my relationship to these other texts that I have shared. I wonder what will happen in the future of the Jewish community if we can model practices like this a little bit more. What if we normalize bringing in stories that are authentic to different pieces, excuse me, of our identities and our cultures? You don't have to be a JOC to have influences in your life that are not strictly Jewish, right? And I believe that modeling from the top of the classroom, that it is okay, it is possible, and it's in fact beneficial to bring in this wisdom as it is authentic to you. I think that puts us in a much, much stronger position as a global Jewish learning community. There's a lot of conversation these days about how to be inclusive of Jews of color. And that's another lecture, that's another conversation. But I do believe that one piece is feeling a little bit more confident in our own Jewishness and recognizing we may have pieces of our lives that are not strictly Jewish. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we are assimilating, that we are losing our Jewishness. In fact, we can allow those pieces of our lives to build our Jewishness, to grow our Jewishness, and to enrich it. So I just want to leave you with a blessing, a moment from a recent time in which I taught a version of this program at HUC as part of a conversation on how to be more inclusive of Jews of color. I need a moment. I'm a human being. 1 second. So my blessing, first of all, is remembering that we are each humans, and what we bring to this learning is the fullness of our being, including our bodies and our breath. There was a person in that class that I taught at HUC who asked this question of me, how can we bring in these pieces of our lives, if we are white Jews? How can we model this from the top of the classroom? So my blessing to you, whoever you may be, is to really think about what are the texts that affect your lives? The stories, the songs, the wonderings. I'm so sorry. Blessings upon blessings to all of you. May your learning be strong and full of breath. May your spirits know no borders. May they grow and take you wherever they desire. Thank you.